The courtroom fell silent as the defendant rose from his seat, his shackled hands trembling slightly. All eyes were fixed upon him. The accused kidnapper, known only as the Taker, in the sensationalized media coverage of his crimes. Though his given name was Edward Callahan, he cleared his throat, his gaze setting upon the judge with a disconcerting calmness.
I'm ready to tell my story now,
He declared, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge, a severe-looking woman in her 60s, nodded solemnly, motioning for him to proceed.
The floor is yours, Mr. Callahan.
Edward Callahan drew a deep breath, his eyes scanning the faces of the jurors before him.
I suppose I should start at the beginning. That's where all stories begin, after all, at the genesis of the tale.
He paused, drumming his fingers against the wooden podium.
I was just a child when it first happened to me, when I was taken.
Murmurs ripped through the gallery, but Callahan raised a hand, silencing them.
I know what you're all thinking. How could someone who was once a victim then become a victimizer themselves? It's a fair question.
His gaze darkened.
The truth is, the experience of being kidnapped as a child left an indelible mark upon me. It changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand, even now.
Callahan leaned forward, his expression almost pleading.
You have to understand, I didn't choose this path. It chose me. The damage had already been done long before I ever took my first victim.
He shook his head slowly, his voice tinged with a hint of sorrow.
I spent so many years feeling lost, alone, craving that connection I had been robbed of. I wanted to reclaim what had been taken from me.
Callahan's gaze hardened once more.
And so I started taking victims of my own, keeping them close, trying to fill that void. I told myself it was the only way I could ever feel whole again.
The judge cleared her throat, her tone stern.
And what became of those victims, Mr. Callahan?
The accused let out a humorless chuckle.
Yes, the $1,000,000 question.
He paused, his eyes drifting towards the gallery, as if searching for an answer there.
Some I let go. Others
He trailed off, his expression growing distant.
well, let's just say not all of them made it out unscathed.
A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, but Callahan held up a hand.
I know, it's a lot to take in. But you have to understand, I wasn't in my right mind. I was broken, damaged. I didn't know what I was doing half the time.
He leaned forward, his shackles clinking against the podium.
All I knew was the pain I felt, the loneliness that consumed me. And I was willing to do whatever it took to make it stop.
Callahan's gaze locked with the judge's, a haunted desperation in his eyes.
So, that's my story. That's how I became the Taker. A cautionary tale, if you will, of how the wounds of the past can shape the actions of the present.
He straightened up, his expression hardening once more.
Now, I'm ready for your questions. Ask me anything you'd like to know.
The judge regarded him for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought.
Very well, Mr. Callahan. Let's start with the beginning. When you say you were taken as a child, can you elaborate on that?
Callahan nodded solemnly.
It happened when I was 8 years old. I was walking home from school, just a few blocks from my house, when a van pulled up beside me.
He paused, his eyes growing distant.
The next thing I knew, I was being shoved inside, blindfolded and bound.
He swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists.
They kept me captive for 2 weeks. 2 endless weeks of terror and uncertainty. I have no idea who they were or why they chose me, but
His voice trailed off, a shudder passing through him. The judge leaned forward, her expression softening slightly.
That must have been an incredibly traumatic experience. Can you tell us what happened during those 2 weeks?
what happens? Well, let's see. I was beaten, starved, and subjugated to unspeakable cruelties. They would taunt me, tell me that no one was coming to save me, that I'd be stuck there forever.
He shook his head slowly.
The physical pain was bad enough, but the psychological torment was what really broke me.
He paused, his gaze drifting to the side.
In the end, they simply let me go, dumped me on the side of the road like a piece of discarded trash. My parents were overjoyed to have him back, of course, but
Callahan's eyes fell shut, a pained expression crossing his face.
the damage had already been done. I was never the same after that. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't even bear to be touched. The world had become a terrifying place, filled with unseen horrors.
He opened his eyes, fixing the judge with a somber stare.
That's when the nightmares began.